Bougainville, November 1943 to August 1945. An island so dense with jungle that aircraft vanished beneath its canopy. An island where more than 23,000 Japanese soldiers would die, mostly without firing a single shot. Not because the Americans stormed their bunkers, not because the Australians annihilated them in open battle, but because their own high command cut them off, abandoned them, and left them to fight the deadliest enemies in the Pacific: malaria, starvation, isolation, and the unforgiving rainforest. This is not the story of a heroic last stand. This is the story of a force left to die slowly, quietly, in a war strategy that destroyed entire divisions without a frontal assault. And nearly nobody talked about it after the war.
Before we dive into the story, give us a quick thumb up and drop "Hi" in the comment and tell us where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel.
When U.S. Marines landed on Bougainville on 1 November 1943, they didn't come to capture the entire island. They came to build airfields close enough to strike the Japanese fortress at Rabaul, once the most feared enemy stronghold in the Pacific. What many viewers don't realize, and what many documentaries fail to explain, is that Japan's 17th Army, nearly 40,000 men, was already doomed. Tokyo had secretly decided that the garrison on Bougainville could not be resupplied, could not be reinforced, and would not be evacuated. By early 1944, American air and naval forces had shut down every Japanese supply route. The soldiers trapped on Bougainville were officially ordered to fight to the last, but unofficially they were already written off. Most would die from disease and hunger long before seeing an enemy face to face. By early 1944, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William Halsey employed one of the most misunderstood strategies of the Pacific War: island isolation. Instead of storming every ridge and bunker, U.S. forces built a defensive perimeter around their airfields and ignored the remaining Japanese positions. The goal was simple: cut the 17th Army off, starve it, let disease and jungle decay finish what bullets did not need to start. This wasn't a moral judgment, it was a strategic necessity. Taking every Japanese stronghold would have cost thousands of American lives. But the isolation strategy had horrifying consequences for the enemy: malaria outbreaks, collapsing morale, rotting supplies, and soldiers reduced to boiling roots and eating grass. Documentary viewers often ask, why didn't they just retreat? Because Japan's high command had already decided none of them were coming home.
Many viewers criticize documentaries for skipping the Australian phase, so let's get it right. In November 1944, U.S. forces were redirected to the Philippines, and the Australian Second Corps took command on Bougainville. Unlike the Americans, who focused solely on isolating the enemy, Australian commanders launched active offensive operations across the island. From late 1944 to August 1945, the Australians advanced on Japanese positions at Slater's Knoll, Pearl Ridge, and the Hongarai River, leading to fierce combat that cost the Japanese 8,500 killed in action and the Australians about 500 dead. But even with renewed battle, starvation remained the dominant killer. By war's end,
An additional 9,800 Japanese soldiers had died from disease and malnutrition. This is where the grim reality becomes clear. Most Japanese dead on Bougainville were not killed by the Australians or Americans, but by the jungle itself.
The collapse began with the stomach. Once aerial and naval interdiction severed Bougainville's sea lanes in early 1944, the 17th Army's stockpiles shrank fast. Rations intended to last months were consumed within weeks. Japanese supply doctrine assumed continued resupply. It did not come. Attempts at local procurement, hunting wild pig, foraging sago, boiling roots, could not replace calories or vitamins. Medical supplies were even scarcer. Quinine and antimalarials were rationed. Bandages and sulfa drugs vanished. Wounded men who might have survived with antibiotics instead sank into infections. Command tried to impose ration discipline, but the jungle defeats logistics. Food caches rotted or were lost on trails, and native carriers collapsed under loads, and airdrops, when they came, were unreliable. Starvation was incremental. First weight, then energy, then the will to resist. By late 1944, many units were skeletal shells of their paper strength. Bullets took lives, but disease took more. The swampy, humid interior of Bougainville was a breeding ground for malaria, dengue, and dysentery. With weakened bodies from hunger, soldiers succumbed quickly. Fever turned disciplined units into disordered bands, with delirious men shivering beneath palm fronds. Japanese field medicine relied heavily on quinine. Shortages forced substitutes that were less effective. Sanitary discipline broke down as latrine pits filled and clean water grew scarce. Hypovolemia from dysentery, untreated septic wounds, and repeated bouts of malaria reduced fighting strength faster than any skirmish. Australian and American medical reports later catalogued brigade-level attrition, where disease accounted for the majority of non-combat losses. For Japanese soldiers, the jungle's pathogens were as lethal as artillery, slow, invisible, and remorseless. Isolation is more than physical. It is informational. As the months wore on, units stopped receiving clear orders. Radio sets failed from humidity. Careers were picked off or died in transit. Tokyo's directives came late, contradictory, or not at all. Field commanders faced impossible choices: strip food to sustain an elite detachment, or try to feed whole battalions, attempt a breakout through Allied lines, or conserve men for a counterattack that would never come. The Imperial Army's ethos valorized holding ground and resisting surrender, but practical command decisions were paralyzed by lack of intel and hope. Letters and field notes recovered after the war show officers pleading for evacuation or resupply. High Command's reply, when received, often reiterated "fight to the death." Those words, meant to sustain morale, instead sealed many units' fate by forestalling surrender and any organized withdrawal. Isolation was enforced from above and beneath the waves. Continuous U.S. and Allied air patrols hunted supply barges and shadowed any movement along the Solomons routes. Naval intelligence and submarine patrols intercepted ships. Blockades strangled resupply attempts. Bombing and naval gunfire didn't always aim to annihilate positions so much as to deny movement. The psychological effect was crippling. Japanese patrols dared not expose themselves to the sky, and supply parties that tried to move at night were vulnerable to ambush or simply got lost in the trackless forest. Airdrops were attempted sporadically, but heavy canopy and poor drop accuracy meant packages often landed in enemy hands or crashed into trees. The reality on the ground, once Bougainville fell inside the Allied sensor net, it became an archipelago prison, isolated, observed, and slowly emptied by attrition, rather than set-piece battle.
Bougainville's geography turned supply problems into death sentences. The island's interior was a morass of steep ridges, mangrove swamps, and finger-like river valleys, a place where maps were guesses and trails ended at impassable gullies. Movement off established routes was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. Japanese supply parties collapsed under the weight of ammunition and rice. Coastwise resupply required shallow draft vessels that the U.S. Navy could intercept. Night moves were hampered by leeches, mud, and the constant risk of falling into enemy lines. For many units, the jungle was less a battleground than a slow suffocation. No clear front, no recovery, just attrition measured in days and inches of lost ground. Survivor notes describe men falling into ravines and never being found. The island itself had become both prison and executioner.
Bougainville was not an empty stage. Indigenous civilians, village families, subsistence gardeners, and coastal fishermen were drawn into the logistics nightmare. Some were coerced as carriers, known to the Japanese as bale or native carriers. Others hid or fled. Food requisitions by occupying forces depleted local stocks and increased hostility between soldiers and villagers. Allied intelligence occasionally relied on local knowledge. Native guides helped track Japanese parties or locate hidden supply caches. But the presence of thousands of starving soldiers devastated the island's fragile food web. Cocoa, taro, and breadfruit plantations were stripped. Fishing lanes were unsafe. After the war, island communities faced their own famine and displacement, an often overlooked consequence of the campaign.
Personal testimonies, letters, diaries, and post-war interviews give the most direct window into daily collapse. One paraphrased entry describes waking to a fog of coughing men, malaria flaring through an entire platoon. Another records burying 3 comrades in a single afternoon and returning to the trench to find the food rations gone. These voices don't romanticize defeat. They record exhaustion, confusion, and a creeping sense of abandonment. Officers wrote pleas for evacuation. Enlisted men wrote of eating sago husks and scavenging for insects to fill empty stomachs. A recurring refrain is not dramatic bravado, but a simple question: where is our supply? Historians use such fragments to map attrition in human terms, not statistics on a page, but faces, voices, and the slow erosion of will that preceded many deaths.
Attrition did not mean the complete absence of combat. Even inside the isolation, patrol clashes, ambushes, and localized assaults continued. Australian patrols probing the jungle encountered stubborn defensive positions, booby traps, and sudden firefights. Japanese troops, depleted but often tenacious, launched counter-patrols and defended key ridgelines where food caches or water existed. At Slater's Knoll and other points, fighting was intense and casualty rates for those engagements were high. These were not mass set-piece battles, but brutal small-unit encounters where terrain, surprise, and the state of bodies
hungry, feverish, decided outcomes. For many soldiers who did fire a weapon, it was in brief, savage episodes amid a campaign defined more by attrition than by maneuvers.
Numbers in war are blunt instruments, but they tell part of the Bougainville story. Estimates vary between sources, but the picture is consistent. Of the roughly 40,000 men assigned to the Japanese 17th Army, only about 17,000 were able to walk out of the jungle after the war. Combat deaths, especially during the Australian offensives from November 1944 to August 1945, accounted for thousands. Histories commonly cite around 8,500 killed in action. Yet disease and malnutrition were equally brutal, with nearly 9,800 recorded deaths attributed to sickness and starvation during the Australian phase alone. That leaves a large number who died earlier or later of deprivation while bypassed by Allied operations. When commentators argue percentages, 57% versus 87%, they usually compare different baselines: total garrison, combat-era strength, or survivors. The essential truth remains: a majority of the dead did not perish in classic pitched battles, but in slow attrition.
The Bougainville campaign was not immune to controversy. In Allied countries, commentators and soldiers debated the morality and utility of bypassing enemy positions. Some newspapers and critics called certain operations pointless. Others praised the strategy for saving Allied lives. In Australia, opinions were sharp. General Sir Thomas Blamey, who oversaw Australian operations in the Southwest Pacific, drew both praise and scorn for his aggressive posture. Military historians note that MacArthur and other theater commanders made hard choices to prioritize strategic objectives, notably the return to the Philippines, which shifted the burden of clearing bypassed Japanese garrisons to Australian forces. The result was a political and human tangle. Operational necessity, national pride, and the grim reality that men were left in conditions the Allies judged strategically acceptable, but morally troubling to some observers and survivors.
Japan's formal surrender on 15 August 1945 transformed Bougainville from an active campaign zone into a scene of negotiated capitulation and difficult logistics. Japanese units, many of them emaciated and disease-ridden, initiated surrender under Australian oversight. The process was slow. Isolated garrisons required verification, mopping up operations, and immediate medical attention. Repatriation was chaotic. Ships and aircraft were limited. Many survivors faced weeks of evacuation from primitive jungle clearings to naval transports. Medical officers recorded shockingly high rates of malnutrition and infection. Men who had survived combat but were physically broken by months or years of deprivation. The walk home for survivors often began only after months of care, a testament to endurance, but also a record of what isolation had exacted.
Bougainville's dead present historians with two problems: record-keeping and remembrance. In the immediate post-war period, Allied burial teams and Japanese records tried to reconcile lists, but the jungle had claimed many bodies, and entire units were stricken beyond clear accounting. For years, much of the campaign lived in footnotes, overshadowed by more visible battles. Yet the island's legacy persisted. Veterans' letters, Australian official histories, and Japanese post-war memoirs kept the memory alive. Local Bougainville communities were forever changed. Modern historians stress an ethical lesson: strategic choices spare lives on one side only when they accept catastrophic losses on the other. Bougainville reminds us that victory can be logistical as well as martial,
and that strategies of bypass and isolation leave human bills that are paid slowly and painfully. If Bougainville was a campaign of attrition, Slater's Knoll was a moment of concentrated combat. In March-April 1945, Australian forces encountered fierce Japanese counterattacks aimed at breaking the Australian drive across the island's central ridges. The fighting at Slater's Knoll featured artillery barrages fought at close range, night attacks, and armored support from Matilda tanks in the mud, a reminder that even in a campaign of isolation, conventional battle still erupted. Australian war diaries record heavy Japanese assault waves and desperate hand-to-hand fighting in the swamps. For Australian units, the toll was painful but measured. For the Japanese, the clashes accelerated already catastrophic losses in men and morale. Slater's Knoll became emblematic, localized intensity inside a wider strategy of bypass and containment.
The Allied chokehold on Bougainville was not accidental. It was engineered. From mid-1944 onwards, U.S. Army Air Forces, Navy patrol planes, and submarines systematically targeted barges, coastal convoys, and jungle landing sites. Long-range aircraft reconnaissance spotted barges. Naval patrols interdicted them. Submarines and destroyers hunted transports by night. These actions reduced resupply to a trickle. Sometimes a single launch intercepted could mean the difference between a unit surviving another month or not. Allied after-action reports emphasize that interdiction, rather than frontal assault, was the most cost-effective way to neutralize Japanese garrisons. For the men on Bougainville, it meant the sky and sea became invisible executioners, denying the most basic lifelines. Post-war testimony from both sides complicates simple narratives of strategic genius or moral failure. Australian veterans often recall relief at avoiding costly frontal assaults and respect for the determination of their adversaries. Japanese survivors speak of betrayal and exhaustion, not in theatrical terms, but in quotidian ones. The ache of hunger, the bitter taste of cooked roots, the quiet of comrades who never rose. Oral histories reveal compassion on the ground. Australian medics treating emaciated captives, Japanese officers entrusting lists of wounded to Allied hands. These voices expose a paradox, an operational victory achieved simultaneously with human tragedy. Listening to veterans, historians must weigh strategy's efficiency against its human cost. Bougainville's wartime scars lasted long after surrender. Islanders faced devastated gardens, unexploded ordnance, and a disrupted social order. Post-war relief missions, both Allied and later colonial administrations, focused on rebuilding plantations and restoring food security. But some communities only recovered after years of aid. The campaign also shaped regional memory. In Australia and Japan, Bougainville remained a contested moral example, a case study in strategy and in the limits of humane warfare. For the islanders themselves, the war was immediate and practical, rebuilding homes, locating missing family, and mourning the dead. The island, that had been a theater of strategic calculation, became, above all, a place of recovery and quiet remembrance.
Throughout 1944 and into 1945, Japanese commanders tried improvisation, fast night barges, jungle airstrips, and desperate overland sorties to move rice and medicine. Many of these attempts failed. Barges were hunted by U.S. PT boats and Navy patrol aircraft. Coastal convoys were shelled or set ablaze. Small wooden Kohio-Teki-style craft were no match for radar-guided search patterns and the Allied submarine net. Air supply worked sporadically where canopy allowed, but parachute drops in heavy jungle often scattered supplies beyond unit control or lodged them in treetops. There were isolated successful extractions, officers wounded, and a handful of supplies evacuated by daring night runs, but nothing scaled to save entire divisions. The cumulative effect? Isolated, starving formations that had tried everything short of mass evacuation and found the sea and sky closed to them.
Disputes over percentages, 57% versus 87%, often stumble on definitions. Are we counting the original 40,000 assigned to the 17th Army in 1943? Or the force present when Australian operations intensified in late 1944? Do we include those evacuated earlier, those who deserted, or island-based auxiliaries? Different baselines produce different percentages. What the archival evidence consistently shows, a large share of Japanese losses resulted from disease and starvation rather than direct combat. Approximately 8,500 Japanese combat deaths are usually cited for the Australian offensive period, with roughly 9,800 recorded deaths from disease/malnutrition in that same span. But other losses occurred earlier under American isolation. The most responsible scholarly approach is not a single headline percentage, but a breakdown. Combat deaths, disease and starvation deaths, and missing or unrecorded, each given with its own baseline and caveat.
Bougainville provoked questions that outlived the fighting. Critics argued bypassing garrisons amounted to abandonment. Defenders argued it was sound strategy that saved Allied lives. In post-war inquiries and histories, voices ranged from those who sought legal accountability for decisions that led to large non-combat deaths to scholars who framed the campaign as difficult but necessary. Australian generals, including Sir Thomas Blamey's critics and supporters, debated publicly and in memoirs. Allied theater command decisions, MacArthur's prioritization of the Philippines, for example, were scrutinized. No international tribunal treated Bougainville as a criminal matter, but ethical debates persisted in academic journals, veterans associations, and diplomatic exchanges with Japan. The campaign therefore remains a case study in the limits of military necessity and the demand for moral clarity in wartime conduct.
After Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast on 15 August 1945 and the formal signing on 2 September 1945, isolated garrisons on Bougainville began to lay down arms. Australian units received and processed surrender parties through late August and into September 1945. Scattered pockets held out until they were contacted, often by patrols or airdropped leaflets. Repatriation continued into October 1945 and beyond. Ships and hospital transports moved thousands to staging areas, and medical teams worked round the clock to treat malnutrition and tropical disease. For many survivors, liberation was immediate relief and the beginning of a long convalescence. For historians, the post-surrender months provided the paperwork to finally enumerate the human cost. The island quieted, but the logistical and moral aftershocks followed for years.
Bougainville forces historians to hold two truths at once: strategic efficacy and human cost. The Allied isolation strategy, interdiction of supplies,
perimeter defense, and selective offensives, achieved its aim, neutralizing a major Japanese bastion without mounting mammoth, casualty-heavy assaults. Yet that calculus produced a different moral ledger. Thousands died slowly of hunger and disease rather than in open battle, and that reality cannot be erased by strategic success alone. Military thinkers today study Bougainville as an example of how logistics and sea-air superiority can render fixed defenses irrelevant, and as a cautionary tale of how strategic necessity shades into ethical ambiguity. Veterans' accounts, Australian operational records, and Japanese memoirs converge on a bleak consensus. Bougainville was a campaign where the environment and attrition were the principal combatants. The lesson is sober and modern. Wars are decided as much by supplies, medicine, and communication as by bravery on a ridge. And those choices leave moral questions that outlast victory.
The last image we leave the viewer with is not of strategy, but of memory. Bougainville today carries the quiet of recovery. Scattered grave sites, carved memorials, and island communities who rebuilt fields and families. Australian engineers and post-war teams helped clear battle detritus. Japanese delegations and veterans groups later traveled to honor fallen comrades. For many families, Japanese, Australian, and Bougainvillian, closure arrived incrementally. A recorded name, an identified grave, a tale passed down. Remembering is imperfect but necessary. Bougainville's story complicates simple war narratives of triumph and defeat. It asks us to remember those who never pulled the trigger and those who did, equally human and equally lost to a decision calculus made far from the jungle. In the end, the island's soft canopy again conceals life and labor, but the silence under its leaves keeps the memory of an entire generation, not erased, but waiting to be heard.